Hi, and welcome to Jacob's Ladder. This is going to be a little bit different from the content that I typically put out. It's going to be a bit more off the cuff, though it is somewhat structured, at least in my head. And it's just something I was thinking about last week, and I wanted to talk about in a kind of short form video where I just lay out my thoughts and see what people think about it. And it sort of centers around the problem of evil, which, if you know about the problem of evil, that is basically the standard argument that you will hear from most agnostics and atheists out in the world as their primary reason for not believing in God. And the problem of evil is typically formatted basically like this. So, if Christians believe in a God that is all-knowing, all good, and all-powerful, then why is there evil in the world? Because we look around us and we see, rape, murder, theft, just destruction and genocide on these massive scales all throughout history. And a lot of times it doesn't feel like God is interacting with that. Like, why doesn't he step in? Why doesn't he stop this from happening if he's so good? And I think a lot of this comes from a misunderstanding of a couple of different things. But it typically is harder for people to counter it just because, we don't like evil as Christians. Like, evil is wrong. And for a person that's just experiencing life and doesn't really know and understand God, it seems like a very compelling argument. And it certainly plays on the pathos of, looking out and seeing people suffering in the world around you. But I think in order to really delve into it, we need to look at, who God actually is and how we can kind of think about the problem of evil in a way that sort of puts a bit more of the power back into the Christian when they're evangelizing. And what I basically came up with is this sort of simple argument that I think you could use as a bit of a counter to the problem of evil that would allow you to get further in a debate with a atheist or agnostic who is proposing this argument. And to lay a framework for it, I kind of want to talk about first what God is. So the Thomistic view of God and sort of like the Anselmian, I don't know if that's a word, view of God. Like Saint Anselm is the one who kind of lays out the classic ontological argument, which says that God is the thing than which nothing higher can be conceived, right? So St. Thomas will say that, like, God is being itself. He will say that God is goodness itself. Not that, good is an attribute that we give to God, or that being is like God is a being like we are beings, but rather that existence and goodness and truth and beauty, these are all things of which God is the origin. They all flow outwards from him. So it's not just that God is good, it's that everything that is good comes from God. So the way we phrase that, is typically that God is, like I said before, he is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, all good. And a lot of times atheists see that as a contradiction, because if there's evil in the world, then and he's all good, well, then he's either not powerful enough to stop it, so he's not omnipotent, or he's not aware of all of it, so he's not all-knowing. But then if he is omnipotent, then he can't be all-knowing and all good, because he would know about it and stop it. Or if he's omniscient and omnipotent, so he knows about it and he can stop it but doesn't, then he's not good, he's evil. And that's the way it's typically kind of thrown out there. But what I think a lot of people don't think about is, the idea of necessary goods and unnecessary goods, and the idea of goods that contradict other goods, and the virtues that we gain from a fallen world that we would not have in another world. So here's my basic premise for this argument. I call it the necessary goods argument, which I kind of just laid the foundation for. And it works sort of like this. If there is a potential good, right? So like something that would be good to have in society, like a good. So like, ice cream is a good, or, charity is a good. If a good that is potential can exist and it doesn't contradict any higher goods. So like, we think there's, like ice cream is a good, but it's not as good as charity, right? So we have like a hierarchy of things that are good where like, self-sacrifice might be one of the highest goods. So if there is a potential good that doesn't contradict any other goods, and that good exists, then that points to a God who is optimally good, right? So like if the greatest goods exist, that points to God. Now, somebody might say that, not having evil is a good. But here's where the second part of the argument comes in. So if there is a potential good that does contradict other higher goods, and that good only exists as a potentiality or does not exist, then that would also point to an optimally good God. Remember, when we're using the term optimally, like that means like as good as it can be. Like, right? Like God is the place from which goodness flows, which means there is nothing more good than him. And we do believe if he's all good, if he is omnibenevolent, that he's going to do the most good thing that can be done. But he doesn't contradict himself. We don't believe that God creates paradoxes because God has a nature, and that nature is good. So therefore, whatever he does do is the most optimally good thing, should he exist. So in this argument, we're basically assuming that God exists and saying, all right, if God exists, and we're trying to make the argument that he's good, if there's a good thing that can exist and is a great good and doesn't contradict any other goods, and that good does exist, then that points to a good God. And if there's a good that could exist but might contradict another good, and that good doesn't exist, then that also points to God. And I can use an example of this to show how this sort of works in practicality. Should human beings exist or not exist? And I think the answer should obviously be yes, they should exist. Or it's better for them to exist, at least. Okay, well, is it better for human beings to exist with free will or without free will? Well, I think most people would say that it's better for them to exist with free will. Okay, can you have free will without the potentiality for the free-willed people to do wrong? In other words, is free will without the proclivity for evil possible? I would say no. Okay, so knowing that, is it better to create human beings who are fallen and susceptible to evil but have free will? Or is it better to just not create human beings at all? And I think that most people would say that it is better to create the human beings. And human beings that are fallen and, have free will do exist. Therefore, that points to an optimally good God. And you can use this kind of logic on pretty much anything, where you're basically examining anything that's good, and you're saying, all right, so this good thing, does it contradict anything else? No. Okay. Does it exist? Yes. Okay, then that's a point for God. But then if you find something that, you think is questionable, right? You go, okay, there's evil here, right? Is this evil here because to erase it might contradict the existence of a higher good. And you can even use this with like natural disasters as an example. So an example I used would be like a tornado. So tornadoes cause a lot of damage in a lot of places, but they're also not everywhere. And their existence is a product of forces of nature like wind and sky and atmosphere that to change would drastically alter the structure of the world. So knowing that, is it better for tornadoes to exist or not exist? Well, if they didn't exist, it would contradict other higher goods that are afforded us by the existence of the structure of the natural forces that create tornadoes in the first place. And therefore, the fact that the good of removing tornadoes is left in favor of the good of having the forces of nature as they are points to an optimally good God that chose to create a world that is optimized for the best possible outcomes with the least possible compromises. So that's kind of the way that I think about this. And this is not like, a proof, though I think you could basically use it in any scenario and it would point to an optimally good God if you broke it down to like its base level, right? Like, I think, for instance, this basically narrows you out of any human action being a good argument for the problem of evil, because all human action ultimately stems back to free will, which you can ultimately say is a greater good, especially when you think about like the virtues that we get, like courage due to the overcoming of evil. It just makes more sense from a optimizing the good of creation standpoint for God to create it this way if he is optimally good. The next thing, that I think is important about this argument, besides being, not a proof, is while it's not a proof that God is optimally good and can be used to kind of like lean in that direction, the main thing that it does is it forces the interlocutor. Well, it forces whoever you're arguing with to adopt moral relativism in order to counter it. And the reason why I say that is, so it's all based off of like whether a certain good is necessary or unnecessary, or like whether a certain good contradicts other higher goods or not. The problem with that would be, well, if you don't believe there are such thing as higher and lower goods, then you could counter it that way and say, well, like, there's no such thing as good and evil. Those are just constructs that are subjective. The problem is, most of us would probably agree from a philosophical standpoint that moral relativism is not very defensible. It doesn't work from a societal standpoint. You can't build very strong structures around it. And because of that, it's not very tenable if you're trying to actually use philosophy for its proper end, which, as I forget, either Socrates or Plato would say, is to teach people how to live well. You can't really live well with moral relativism. You can only live well by believing intellectually in moral relativism, but then living as though you believe in objective morals. It just doesn't work functionally on a societal scale. So because of that, this argument forces the other person to take on a belief in moral relativism. And most people, even though there are a lot of atheists that are like popular YouTubers and like people on college campuses that might say that they believe in moral relativism, the majority of people are not moral relativists. And so forcing them to go into moral relativism in order to counter your argument is actually a point in your favor, because they have to change their worldview in order to stop it. And most people are more likely to concede that the problem of evil doesn't work than they are likely to suddenly switch over and decide that they're a moral relativist. And if they do, you're probably not making much progress with them anyway. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about, is this idea of the necessary goods argument, which I'll restate real quick here at the end. I think I wrote it down, actually, so I'll just read the exact form that I wrote, and you can decide for yourself if you think this is good. If we assume that there is a God, he would be the highest possible being, and he would be optimally good, true, and beautiful. So, if we're trying to prove this, is it better for a potential good that does not contradict other higher goods to exist or not exist? It's more good for it to exist. Therefore, if it exists, it points to an optimally good God. And if there is a potential good that does not contradict other higher goods, is it better for it to exist or not exist? It's more good for it to exist only as a potentiality. And therefore, if it does not exist in actuality, it points also to an optimally good God. And the example, like I said, is it better that human beings exist or not exist? It's better that they exist. Is it better for human beings to have free will or not to have free will? It's better for them to have free will. Is it possible for free will to exist without the potentiality for evil? Does not seem to be. Is it better for human beings to have free will with the potentiality that they utilize it for evil, or for human beings not to exist? It is better for them to exist. Flawed human beings with free will do exist. I'm one of them. Therefore, God appears to be optimally good. So it's just something to think about. I hope that this is helpful for you if you deal with the problem of evil often. And let me know in the comments if you think that this is all stupid and not useful as an argument whatsoever, and maybe you'll help make me a better lay theologian and philosopher. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.